Some of you may not know this, but this past October marked the 5-year anniversary of Friday Night Arcade on YouTube. I launched the first ever episode reviewing Space Quest 3, The Pirates of Pestilon, all the way back on October 18th, 2014, and well, 5 years later, here we are. That episode is still sitting out there, and you should absolutely not watch it because it's pretty terrible. But it's crazy to think Friday Night Arcade has been around for 5 whole years now. So I just wanted to take a moment and thank all of you for your support. Whether you've been watching since the beginning or just discovered the channel more recently, thanks for watching my silly little show, and here's to the next 5 years. In the years since the channel's launch, I've slowly but surely made my way through the rest of the Space Quest series, so it only makes sense to mark the 5-year anniversary of the show with a look back at the last official chapter in the Space Quest series. It's Space Quest 6, The Spinal Frontier, on this edition of Friday Night Arcade. Space Quest 6 is the last officially released game in the Space Quest series of adventure games from Sierra Online. If you've never played Space Quest before or aren't really familiar with adventure games on computer, here's the short version of how these worked. You explore an area, find items, use those items in combination with other items in your inventory, or use them to interact with other stuff in the environment to solve some sort of puzzle, and then you can proceed to the next area. Or die trying and you have to reload a previous save. Lather, rinse, and repeat until you eventually get to the end of the game. These games are meant to make you think and utilize problem solving, not much dexterity required. I love these types of games when you're in the mood to just sit back and chill with a video game without going all white knuckle like with something along the lines of Ninja Gaiden. What sets the Space Quest series apart from other games in the genre is the over-the-top humor and wacky science fiction and pop culture references. The gameplay is secondary. Half the fun is just exploring this zany universe the developers created. These games were created by Scott Murphy and Mark Crow, aka the two guys from Andromeda, and their warped sense of humor is really the star in this entire series. However, the two guys weren't as heavily involved with Space Quest 6, but I'll get to that in a bit. For now, what you need to know is these games are parodies and not meant to be taken too seriously. If you grew up reading Mad Magazine, you'll feel right at home in Space Quest. Now, at this point, in order to discuss Space Quest 6 much further, I'm going to have to get into spoiler territory for previous games in the series. You may want to backtrack and watch my videos on the first 5 games, or pause entirely until you've had a chance to play them for yourself. Just a heads up. So anyway, in these games you play as hapless janitor turned hero Roger Wilco. Roger is a goof that always finds himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. He typically stumbles into the hero role totally by accident, and the fact that he's not really a hero is what makes him instantly relatable. He's just a normal guy. Part 6 picks up immediately after Roger saved the galaxy from a horde of toxic mutants in Space Quest 5, but instead of returning home to a hero's welcome, we find Roger getting dressed down, quite literally, by his captain. He gets demoted from captain back down to second-class janitor and stuck on mop-up duty. It's a bit of a kick in the pants seeing Roger get slapped back down to janitor after finally working his way up to captain of his very own spaceship in Space Quest 5, even if it was just a garbage scow, but I guess we should expect that from our lovable loser hero. The rest of the story here takes a while to get going. You start out on shore leave on the planet Polysorbate 60. It's similar to Space Quest 3 when you start out on the garbage freighter, but at least there it's clear what the goal was. Find and repair a spaceship so you can escape. But here it's not really clear what you're supposed to be doing, and it kinda just feels like you're frittering your afternoon away. Actually, the game throws you a curveball right out of the gate when a transporter accident leaves Roger stuck in concrete in the middle of the street. The first puzzle of the game is just figuring out how to get unstuck so you can actually, move around. Eventually, someone attempts to kidnap Roger, and that's where business starts to pick up. From there, the story takes you across the oddest mix of locations in the series. You'll board the Deep Ship 86, ascend above Deep Space Nine that happens to look an awful lot like a jockstrap. You eventually steal a spaceship and take off on your own, exploring a mad scientist lab, the information superhighway, which is literally a virtual superhighway that's still under construction. This was 1995 after all. The interface for this is Windows 3.1. You eventually get shrunken down to explore the oddly accurate and specific insides of a human body. Science fiction and movie parodies run amok with obvious references to Star Trek, Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Blade Runner, The Terminator, the Alien franchise, Inner Space, and even Roadrunner. And that's always where these games shine. You just want to hang around in these areas for a while and see what all nonsensical jokes the programmers stuck in there. In the arcade, there's an obvious parody of Street Fighter 2 called Stooge Fighter, a fighting game where you play as the Three Stooges. E.T. is all drunk on the floor of a liquor store. The captain of the Deep Ship 86 is Captain Kielbasa. He looks a lot like the Kilrathi, the cat people from Wing Commander. His captain's chair is just a big cat bed, and he sounds like a discount Captain Picard.
I'd like to thank each and every one of you for your fine performance during our recent episode, A Stitch in Time Saves Gamma 9.
So that's another thing, this game has voice actors, and I have sort of a love-hate relationship with that side of the game. On the one hand, the game is narrated once again by legendary Gary Owens, and he's totally on point throughout, typically taunting you and Roger throughout the game.
Wow, the static energy you built up discharged, frying Lard Boy's circuitry. Did you actually think of that, or was it just luck?
Every joke isn't necessarily a home run, but when they do hit, the self-deprecating and irreverent humor is genuinely laugh-out-loud funny even still today. Gary Owens pretty much steals the show here, and they programmed in goofy descriptions for just about everything in the game. You can take your time in an area and just click on random stuff to see what he has to say about it.
Gee, sure could use a no-pest strip.
There's a funny running gag too about this rotting fish that Roger just can't seem to get rid of.
Hey, here's your fish!
Let's just say you might need that later on in the game. But for as good as Gary Owens is, the rest of the voice acting doesn't quite measure up. That's not to say it's bad. It's not as laughably terrible as it was in Space Quest 4, but it's just kinda off-kilter. Sometimes the actor's tone doesn't really match the emotion of the story, or sometimes the scenes just kinda drone on and on and on, and it's just not all that interesting or funny. It's like, okay, get on with it and just tell me where I'm supposed to go next. The story also introduces a new love interest for Roger named Stellar Santiago, which is a pretty massive continuity error from previous games in the series, considering Roger's very life seemed to depend on him eventually marrying Beatrice Wankmeister, who we met in Space Quest 5, and in the future fathering a son who travels back in time and saves Roger's life in Space Quest 4. It's hard to say what the thought process was behind this. That wasn't the only continuity error either. Captain Kilbasa mentions Roger successfully bringing back the SS Eureka intact at the beginning of the game, but yeah, we totally blew that thing up. So okay, I mentioned earlier that the two guys from Andromeda weren't really as involved with this game, and here's what happened. It turns out this game was primarily written and developed by Josh Mandel. He worked on other Sierra titles such as Callahan's Cross Time Saloon and The Dagger of Amon-Ra, and he also voiced King Graham in the King's Quest series. Mark Crow wasn't involved at all, and Scott Murphy really didn't get involved until Mandel left Sierra Online about 3/4 of the way through the project. After Mandel left, Scott Murphy was basically asked by Sierra to step in and kind of cobble everything together to get the game finished and up for sale, and that eventually led to some problems. Any good puzzle game should have some reasonable clues embedded somewhere along the way for the player to find so that they can feasibly solve said puzzle without the need for a walkthrough or a hint book. Everything you need should be somewhere in the game, but this isn't really the case in Space Quest 6. For example, one puzzle in the game involving rearranging computer chips in the data quarter can only be solved if you have the manual, becoming an indirect form of copy protection for the game. But if you didn't have the manual, you were pretty much hosed. Andel later spoke about this in an interview. He said, one of the inventory items cut was a comic book CD in Nigel's room that was fully readable and had all of the hints to the data quarter puzzle. From a writing and design standpoint, it was fully finished, and I know that Barry Smith had started the artwork. I don't understand why it was cut, but the comic book content was something I'd worked on for months. It was something that I was uncharacteristically proud of. I think it would have been one of the greatest parody sequences in the Space Quest series, so not only was I very upset not to see it in the game, but the fact that they had to put the data quarter hints in the manual, leading players to think it was meant to be copy protection, disturbed me greatly. So yeah, stuff like that happened. Also, the plot is a bit darker in tone than previous entries. You eventually figure out the game's main villain is this sickly old woman named Champaign, who's conducting terrible experiments to reverse the effects of aging so she can take over a younger host and live forever. It's kinda messed up and not nearly as amusing as, say, Sludge Vohal attempting to wipe out all life on Roger's home world of Xenon by unleashing millions of cloned insurance salesmen in Space Quest 2: Vohal's Revenge. So how does Space Quest 6 measure up against other entries in the series, and is it still worth playing today? Well, that's a tricky question. If you've never played Space Quest before, I definitely wouldn't recommend starting off with this one. Some of the puzzles are pretty convoluted, and the story isn't nearly as good as some of the other games. You're probably better off starting out with Space Quest 3 or maybe even Space Quest 5, since they're a bit more straightforward. But if you're a fan of Space Quest, absolutely it's still worth checking out. Just be prepared to grab a walkthrough for a few of the puzzles because they really make no sense. But once the game gets going, it is legitimately funny for the most part, and worthy of the name Space Quest. Like I mentioned before, it's always fun spending time in this goofy universe they created, even if it's not the best in the series. There's also more than enough Easter eggs and references to earlier entries in the series to keep hardcore Space Quest fans satisfied. For example, there's a bunch of items you used in earlier Space Quest games just randomly scattered around in Roger's quarters.
Wow, it's your official employment rejection letter from Sierra Online at the end of Space Quest 3. It just says, "Not a chance," and it's signed by Ken Williams.
That sniveling weasel Elmo Pug and Fester the shopkeeper from Space Quest 3 also make cameo appearances. Turns out Elmo's been pretty down on his luck since Roger bested him back on Pestilon, and that's especially gratifying.
Say, you look familiar. Didn't I kick your butt in a huge robot once?
It's also just kind of crazy to see how far this series has come. From its humble beginnings all the way back in 1986, featuring all 16 beautiful colors in that AGI engine, to 1995 utilizing super VGA graphics and 256 colors, Space Quest 6 also features some fully rendered graphics sequences that utilize the CD-ROM medium, similar to other PC games of the time like The Seventh Guest, and they're very well done. But for as good as these look, some of the art direction is kinda dark and muddy. This makes it tough to see what all objects you're supposed to be picking up or interacting with in an area at a given time. For example, hunting down a specific CD-ROM in this one room, what am I even looking at here? You have to click on just the right spot. Gary Owens even references this later in the game, so maybe they realized this.
Good eyesight. Now we'll have to do one of those puzzles where you have to find a 1-pixel coin or something. But hey, who'd design a mean, unfair puzzle like that?
The dreary streets of Polysorbate 60 and the boringly beige interiors of the Information Superhighway filing cabinets are also a stark contrast from the colorful and absurd planets that populated earlier entries in the series. And I also have to at least mention the fact that it's almost impossible to die in this game compared to previous entries. In older games in the series, solving puzzles usually meant dying at least half a dozen times in some sort of over-the-top and delightfully devious manner before you finally figured out the right solution, and that was half the fun. This time around, Gary Owens usually warns you that that's not a good idea if you try to do something stupid, and you almost have to work at finding legitimate ways to die.
It's pretty sticky out there. Maybe you should wear your EVA suit. That's not a request, Roger. If you want out, put on the damn suit.
For better or for worse, this game holds your hand a lot more so than other games in the series. And the open-ended conclusion to this game leaves a bit to be desired. Although Roger gets the girl, or rather, a girl, it leaves a lot of unanswered questions and ultimately feels like a bit of a letdown.
Anyway, I think you're gonna like your next assignment.
Really? What is it? Where is it?
Sorry, you're just gonna have to wait to find out.
It's disappointing that we'll never know because although there was a plan for Space Quest 7 at one point, it was eventually canceled and now the rights to the Space Quest franchise isn't even in the hands of the two guys from Andromeda that created it. That lovable oaf Roger Wilco is destined to be in video game purgatory forever, and that's just kinda sad, especially with this final entry in the series ending with a bit of a thud. The two guys have been working on a spiritual successor to the Space Quest franchise called Space Venture, but developing video games independently is hard, so it may yet be a while before we see the final release of that one. Well, what did you think? Did you play Space Quest growing up? And if so, what is your favorite entry in the series? What are some of your other favorite text adventure games you'd like to see covered here on the channel? As always, thank you for watching. Please don't text and drive, and I'll see you next time on Friday Night Arcade.
This world's a great big ball of dirt with 50 billion souls who like to sit around and veg down in the dark like moles. But me, I'm just the kind of girl who loves the open air and bits of unburned hydrocarbons blowing through my hair. New soil and clear, at last it's here with clearly better taste. Less people too, like me and you, and less reprocessed waste. More hearty crunch for snacks or lunch, it's crystal clear to see. New soil and clear, the last frontier for folks like you and me. New soil and clear, clearly less people, clearly more taste.